Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to the channel. I got to warn you, this is kind of an unscripted reaction to an Answers in Genesis article that they just posted. It's about Arctic foxes or snow foxes. As you can see here, here's a couple snow foxes as envisioned by Sora, an AI video generator who's apparently thinks that snow foxes can walk across the snow without leaving any footprints at all. But it does show the basic features of a snow fox or an Arctic fox, and that is very furry, very white in the wintertime. They're actually brown during the summer. They have to endure extreme cold temperatures because they live in the Arctic at up to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And they are a form of canine, and so here you see the canine features. This article at Answers in Genesis is about the Arctic fox, and the essential point of it is I can sum it up really quickly. It's look at these amazing characteristics. This thing is perfectly adapted for its environment. It can handle these incredible winter temperatures. It can find food. It has an amazing nose where it can smell carrion from miles and miles away. Has tracking ability, so it has behaviors that allow it to survive in this environment. So in other words, what are we really saying here? It's well adapted. In other words, it is designed for this particular environment, right? It has a unique set of characteristics that make it suitable for this particular environment. And therefore, God made this. Right? I mean, that would be the Answers in Genesis mantra, is that these are such amazing features that only God could have done this. But, if you have watched any of my videos, and if you are familiar with young earth creationism, or you are a young earth creationist, that I just painted a very simplistic picture of how God has created. Now, many of you might have that simplistic, idea that either you're not a young earth creationist and you feel like that's what young earth creationists are saying, that God just snaps his fingers and voila, there's Arctic foxes. Kind of like I just typed in some words into Sora and voila, there's some Arctic foxes on the screen for you. It was just that magical. But so, and some young earth creationists might actually think that way, that God made all the different species and he made them exactly for different habitats like this. But more sophisticated young earth creationists actually wouldn't say that at all. All right. They would object to the way I described my original description. They would say, look, Joel, I understand that, when we use the word designed, we're saying like this is amazing design. We're not saying that God necessarily made an Arctic fox originally, right? On the sixth day of creation, when he created the land animals, he didn't just say like Arctic fox and boom, there it was. It was created on that particular day, and it's been an Arctic fox ever since, because they would recognize that there wasn't any Arctic in the original creation, right? Young earth creationists don't think that there was a polar ice cap. And there weren't, and also there wasn't any death. All right. And if there's no death, Arctic foxes wouldn't be searching for the type of food that they are eating here in the Arctic. And if there was no Arctic, they wouldn't need this amazing fur coat. All right. They wouldn't need to be able to smell carrion from 25 miles away. And if you just go down the list of all the unique features they have that make them perfectly well suited, like amazingly adapted for this particular environment. All those characteristics, not necessary in the original creation on that sixth day of creation, with respect to what young earth creationists would say. So those young earth creationists say like, no, I wouldn't expect to have actually seen an Arctic fox. And so that means if thinking through the logic here, then what was created on the sixth day? Well, they would say, well, there was a form of canine that was produced on the sixth day, right? Something that embodies canineness, all right? A set of features that is like the average or the shared characteristics that all canines have. So if you think like felines is like an animal that had retractable claws, right? And whiskers and a certain color, certain kinds of eyes and so forth that cats have. And then once he created this basic canine, that canine then was then adapted in its offspring into many different locations on Earth and became the things that we see today. Again, I'm telling the same story I've told many times. So if you're a regular viewer of my videos, you know that we've kind of gone over this story, and you might be wondering, like, well, where am I going? What's new? Like, Joel, what are you going to do? What are you going to say that's going to, do something a little bit different than what you usually say? Well, I have to provide the background, right, in order for me to get to the next step. And I'm going to be pondering a few things in this particular video that I've maybe never expressed. And I'm kind of just giving it a try. Like, I'm going to try to express my frustration and my own questions I have for young Earth creationists. And you could say these are questions for myself as well. And it has to do with divine interaction. All right. How does God guide his creation? You see where I'm going? If the original type of things, for young Earth creationists, the original canine didn't look like this, then how did you go from the original canine to this thing, which you now are saying is designed and perfectly adapted to this particular environment? And you use the words, things like God made this Arctic fox. What does it mean to say God made something, right? When he didn't snap his fingers and make it. What is the process? What is the method of making, right, an Arctic fox? And I want to explore that idea a little bit. Now, to do that, I need to go to the article that inspired me to talk about this and just show you a few things that this particular young Earth creationist is saying about Arctic foxes in order to sort of give me the room then to explore, right, the whole question of how does God act in the world to change organisms over time? What's that method? And just to give away a little bit of what I think I'm going to come to a conclusion, or what I think that I'm going to say, all right? Because I'm not exactly where I'm going to go with this. I have some basic ideas in my head. We'll see what pops out as I explore this. But one of the things that's kind of like, bumping around inside of here is the idea that young Earth creationists really aren't any different than theistic evolutionists. I don't think at the end of the day, if you push them, I think if you force them to say what they don't really say out loud, is that ultimately I think that they're theistic evolutionists. Right. So let me try to explain that. This was the article posted on Answers in Genesis website. It's a link to a very simple article because it's on their Kids Answers website. I even have it set for kids mode right now. So this is what you would see if you let your child, use the internet, and here they're allowed to come to this kids page from Answers in Genesis. And this article, December 29th, by Tom Hennigan. And I tell you, Tom Hennigan is a biology professor at a Christian college. All right. And he's written many articles for Answers in Genesis, and he's written another article about Arctic foxes, which is in their magazine, which has a lot more details. So this is like the boiled down version, but it captures the essential point that I'm going to use as a jumping off point for myself. And all of his articles, though, are very similar. He's written many, many articles that sort of like, here's an organism. And he's done it on the fennec fox as well, which is adapted to what? To desert climates. So here's a canine that has a different suite of characteristics that is amazingly well adapted and designed, right, for the desert. And here's the Arctic fox now that is designed for the Arctic. And what I'm thinking about is, how do you start with one animal? Or if it's, the pair that's on the ark, that pair in the ark couldn't have been Arctic foxes, couldn't have been fennec foxes, or if they were one or the other, then the other one has to evolve or develop, right, from the other ones. And how does that happen? Like, what is the exact mechanism for that change to occur? Not to mention, there's 100 other species of canines. Not all alive today, but we have many extinct versions, which are also post-flood. And so therefore, they all had to have evolved from just 2 individuals to become this amazing Arctic fox and all the other ones. All right, so let me just briefly go through like some basic points. Right, and it's like, I think I was saying that Tom Hennigan has written many articles. The fennec fox, the Arctic fox, hummingbirds, this, that, different amazing creatures, and the message is always the same. Here's a bunch of really specific characters that they have. These characters are, exquisitely designed for their particular environment, and therefore, that's proof that God made them. Never really mentions this process that I'm talking about here, because he never really acknowledges most cases that the original organism must have been very different. And so if you have a perfectly adapted organism here, but something different before, there must be some transition. Like, how do you go from perfect in the original creation to some super well-designed organism for a later, very different world? That's the question here. The Arctic fox lives in really cold place. It's only about 10 pounds. It's a little tiny thing, right? Whereas there are other canines that are very large. There's some extinct canines that were maybe several hundred pounds. So we have a lot of diversity in terms of the size of canines. So it's got amazing short fur. It's brown fur in the summer when the snow has melted and it needs to blend in, right? That's one of its adaptive features. In order to find its prey, it's a color that matches its environment, right? Well, that's amazing design. That is an amazing adaptation. But it's only an adaptation that is necessary for that organism in a post-fall world, right? For young Earth creationists, there's no death in the original creation. They wouldn't have been hunting. Why would you need to be able to sneak up on your prey when there weren't any prey? Because you didn't eat any prey. You ate, veggies. And you don't need to sneak up in your veggies. Last I checked, right? So you don't need cryptic patterns or anything like that in order to hide in your environment. And you don't need to hide in your environment to protect yourself from other predators that might be seeking after you. And so all these features then are not features that are thought to have been in the original creation. And you even have behavior here, right? You have, what are behaviors? Ultimately, many behaviors are different genetic conditions, such that the genes are causing different behavioral patterns in different dogs. But if you just started with one set of dogs or 2 dogs on the ark, how did they have hundreds of different behaviors built into their genome and then separate out those behaviors into separate descendant lineages that had just the right behaviors for the environment that they're in, not some mixture of behaviors? Like my behavior is like I have a behavior for living in the Arctic, but I also have another behavior that's adapted for living in the desert at the same time. How did you get to the point where you had all the combination of behaviors that allows you to live in the Arctic and a completely different combination of behaviors that allows you to live in the desert habitat, along with all the morphological features that allow you to live in that place? They have this amazing coat. They change their coat colors, right? That's something that dogs that live in the desert don't do, right? This is only the Arctic fox that does this. They change their coat color, right? Their nose is awesome, right? They can eat almost anything. I think in here, maybe it's the other article I was reading, they say they can smell something from 20 miles away. They have amazing noses to find meat and other animals like polar bears have already killed. So they come in and sort of pick up the scraps. They have amazing ears, and the ears are really small. Right now here comes the word. Here's the word that triggered me. Would not be quite the right word, but you get the idea. God equipped Arctic foxes with small ears that are covered in thick fur to prevent them from losing too much heat. Right? Their ears are so powerful they can hear rodents running under the snow. right? You've probably seen those foxes that jump up and they're hearing what's happening on the snow. They jump up and push their snout on the snow and catch their prey underneath there. They dive headfirst in the snow. Dinner is served. That's a behavior. I mean, you take your dog and take it up to the Arctic and see if it'll do that. Find its prey that way. Not likely. Take a wolf. Take a coyote. Take a red fox, like the ones that live here in Ohio. You take it to the same location. They're not going to do that, right? They're not adapted for that location. And even if you kept them there for many, 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 many generations, and you fed them and so forth, they wouldn't learn that behavior there in the space of thousands of years even. All right, so I'm to the bottom of the article already. Right? Every feature of this Arctic fox tells of a thoughtful and careful designer, right? God's equipped this. It's an amazing design. And in the other article, it talks about the fact that these Arctic foxes were made, right? Use the word made for survival in the Arctic. So how exactly does God make an Arctic fox the way that it is? Now, I think some of you would have heard me in the past, and maybe if you're a younger creationist, you know what I think the pat answer is for this, the general answer, although there's disagreement among younger creationists. They would say God created the original canine kind with gobs of variation, right? Incredible variation, like lots and lots and lots of different genetic variants. Now, all these variants couldn't have been, they all had to be good variants. Like they didn't have diseases or anything like that, right? Variants in their mind would be brown hair, white hair, bigger ears, smaller ears, like genes for slightly different size pads or different amounts of hormone production. So they make them larger versus smaller, right? So there's lots and lots and lots of variation. Now in the original creation, they often visualize the original creation as being kind of homogeneous, like all a wonderful place. There's plenty of food to eat, not meat, right? Plenty of food to eat. There's no want. There's no need for anything. Everything is provided. So they don't need like special features in order to be able to procure their food or to be able to preserve themselves or, to be able to attack or defend themselves, right? None of that is necessary. So they kind of have some really generic features. But nonetheless, somehow they have lots of variety, lots of variation. There's lots of themes. And I guess you could have like every possible variant. You could have dogs with like really long back legs and short front legs. And you could have ones with really long tails and tiny snouts. And you could have because, those characters don't matter, right? I mean, they don't have a survival value really. I mean, it's not going to hurt to have an extra long tail or to be a different color, right? To be orange or brown or red or, because that's just variation. And since you can't die, you're not going to be affected by that. I don't know. I mean, there's a huge question about what exactly would the original creatures have looked like. However, all that kind of doesn't matter. There's lots of variation. Ultimately, there's a bottleneck, right? You only have 2 canines that Noah brings to the ark. And so when they get on the ark, they can't possibly have all the variation that all the other canines had that were there before the ark, even if God had created everything with lots and lots of variation. The very fact that they've reproduced means they've lost a lot of their variation, or they've spread it out among a lot of individuals. So any individual is going to have a subset of the variation, the original variation. So they get on the ark, and there's just 2 of them, and now they get off the ark. And here is the big question. Here's the thing that I think about a lot, too much. I know it's a weird obsession. So you're going to have an Arctic fox someday. There's no Arctic fox on the ark. And then when they get off the ark, and the original pair has offspring, do you think that one of the offspring that was born was just an Arctic fox with this particular set of characteristics? No, it would be like a complete hodgepodge of characteristics. How would you get the exact set of characteristics you need in an Arctic fox? How would you get all of those characteristics together? I can tell you this is thousands of genes. right? Thousands of individual variants where this Arctic fox has, you go down, you run down 1,000 genes. It's like, well, it has this variant, 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 right? It's not just about coat color. It's not about, turning on, making hairs in the ears and having extra amounts of hair in the feet so you're not, getting cold pads. And it's about different behavioral patterns, about changing your coat in the spring and in the fall. And then it's about, different kinds of different ability to hear than other foxes have, right? Different sense of smell, smells for certain kinds of chemicals more so than maybe other dogs have, right? And we could just go on and on and on and on and on. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of characteristics that as a group, as a package, make the Arctic fox capable of surviving in this environment, where if you take any of your canines, right, from wherever you live and you transport them, they got no chance. And by the way, if you brought an Arctic fox down here, I mean, you could keep an Arctic fox alive, right? You could probably semi-domesticate one. But if you're like, just throw it out in the woods here and say like, have at it, have a wonderful life, it's not going to be a wonderful life, right? For that Arctic fox. It's not well adapted to finding resources in this particular environment. It's not adapted to the temperatures here. Right? Its physiology is different, right? Its metabolism is different. They can go into kind of a stupor, which when they lower their metabolic rate, and so forth, to save energy. And they know to eat a lot at one time of the year to build up resources. And then they use all those resources in the winter. It's a whole different life habit. And this is, like I said before, I cannot emphasize this enough. This is thousands and thousands of genes, all of which have to work together to make a functional Arctic fox. So now, let me try to explain where my biggest question is. My biggest question for young Earth creationists, the thing that what I'm doing is I'm going to challenge them to think about this question. Going back a little bit, I said that here's what I think young Earth creationists would say, and this is what I often hear. There was lots of variation. I started that story. I need to finish it so you'll understand where I'm going. They get off the ark and they would say, yeah, there's still lots of variation. So because there's lots of variation, then you have mixing of the alleles. You have mixing of the two individuals as they make sperm and egg. And so they make offspring that have different variations, right? You have 10 offspring, and each offspring has like a whole different package of variants. And so you would have had 10 offspring that look very different from each other. But of course, they're living in one environment, one same environment. Some of them are going to be like, hey, I'm pretty good with this particular environment. And other ones are going to be like, boy, I got a terrible package of variants for this environment, right? It doesn't make me adapt at all for this particular place. And then maybe those individuals are traveling. And I think what young creationists visualize is that dogs will spread across the earth, and maybe they're not adapted for where they're living at that time, but they manage to survive. And then they get to locations where maybe they have like a thicker fur coat and it's colder there, and they survive okay there. And this is sort of like the simple story of like, oh, well, then they just, so it's natural selection, right? That's ultimately their answer. It's like, it's natural selection. They have genetic variation. It gets all mixed up. And then from that mixture, you get random piles, meaning this dog has a random assortment of variants. This dog has a random sort of variants. This dog has a random set of variants. And because they all have different packages, they have different characteristics, and some of those characteristics will survive in whatever environment they're in. And they end up being the winners, right? The survivors, the one that are more likely to have offspring themselves. In which case they create more dogs that are kind of similar to them. They scramble everything up again, and you get some new variant combinations, and some of them will be even better adapted. And what they see is they gradually get better and better and better and better adapted to an environment. And that's where an Arctic fox comes from, right? You've taken the massive amounts of variants, and you've kind of like selected out all the variants that work best to make an Arctic fox. And if you're thinking, yeah, okay, I mean, that sounds reasonable, I can tell you that's not reasonable from a population genetic standpoint. I mean, it's reasonable from a, you've got 500,000 years to do it type of thing. Okay. It is something that could happen. You have a population that's living in an environment like Ohio, and they're adapted for this particular location. And then some of the ones on the edge, the northern edge, right? They gradually become more adapted to even colder temperatures in Canada, right? But that's takes thousands of years, thousands of generations, and they become, the ones on the fringe of that species, right? They're living in slightly different conditions are going to gradually become more adapted for that. But it's going to take thousands of generations to sort out alleles that are best packages, right? Best groups of alleles that not just allow you to be better in the cold, but also adapt to different food sources, right? I got to learn how to catch this particular type of rabbit, which is different than the one in Ohio. And because that rabbit behaves differently, I got to have a different strategy for catching it, right? That's going to require slight changes in genes and so forth that are going to create new habits, right? New strategies, right? And probably, running slightly faster or being a little more agile and being able to jump a little bit better because, there's more obstacles in this environment than there were in the environment that my neighbors are in down south. And all of those things take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations for natural selection to sort out. So if you're gonna use natural selection as like, oh, natural selection is just like this magic elixir that just kind of like in a few generations you suddenly have 1,000 different alleles which were part of a mixture with thousands of other alleles, and you're just gonna kind of like sort them all out and like, boom, I got an Arctic fox. No, that is not. You're not gonna be able to mathematically model that. You're not gonna be able to show that that can occur. You can show that it can occur to one gene, one allele, like you have two alleles and they get sorted. But when you start talking about thousands of alleles, how do you get all the right ones together? Now, this is where my theistic evolution thing comes in. This is where I'd say that young earth creationists really are theistic evolutionists, but they're theistic evolutionists on steroids, where they say that God is acting in a more direct, more interventionist way than most theistic evolutionists would say. A theistic evolutionist say like God is using natural selection, genetic drift, mutations in order to shape, even if we can't actually measure it, that he is overall in charge of the entire process and guiding. Now, I don't want to get into all the different variations of theistic evolution and how that guidance could occur. There's a lot of different theories and how much guidance. My whole point here is that for what does the creationists think is happening here? If you randomly if you have two animals and they cross with each other, they're going to end up with random piles of variants that they give to their offspring. Those are not going to be perfectly adapted to that new environment. And yet you use the language all the time of like, hey, look at these organisms. They are like super well adapted. God gave them. I mean, what was the language in here? The language in here is, the language in here is God equipped these critters. So again, I'm coming back to this really fundamental question about what does it mean that God equips? How did he equip? How did he equip these Arctic foxes? Did he just create the variation? And then the variation, every generation is randomly scrambled, right? And then from that random scramble, you get a whole bunch of variants that come together. And then at some point, many, 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 many generations later, now for younger creationists, are going to say like this had to have occurred within 50 generations. 50 generations later, the right combination was finally struck, right? We got all these different variants and they all came together, right? And if you did the odds on that, if you had the original organism, you said like, here's all the variants in the female and the male, and here's all the original variation. And you said, what are the chances that you would get this variant plus this one, 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 and do 5,000 of those and say that every one of those you have to get together all into one animal, right? The possibilities are you could make 100 million different animals because there's like 100 million different ways you could recombine those different variants. But out of those 100 million different combinations of variants, 99 point something million of those are going to be unfit for whatever their environment is. They're not going to have the right combination. They're going to have like, hey, great, I got this thing, like I got long hair, but I also got, something else that makes me completely unadapted for living in the cold. Right? And another dog's like, well, I got little short ears, which help me, help me not get cold, right? Not let heat escape from my ears. Arctic foxes have smaller ears than desert foxes, which have large ears. But then they didn't end up with hair growing, on the bottom of their feet. All right, so disadvantage. Oh, you see what I'm saying here? Go back to the probabilities there. I could make 100 million different variations, but out of those 100 million, most of them are not fit for the environment. They have the wrong combination. Where did the right combination come from? Right. And so that's where you might say, I think young creationists, what I'm saying is they're going to have to come in, they're going to have to say, it couldn't just be that this is just random scrambling. And then the process of natural selection selects out of that random set of many, many variations. It goes like, oh, that combination kind of works here. So that one will survive better than another one. And then we'll take the ones that survive better and they'll randomly scramble up their genes as they reproduce to make offspring. And they have multiple offspring. And some of them will have a better combination. All right. And then nature will select that particular combination because it fits better in the environment. And then their offspring will have more similar genes to them. And they're going to scramble things up a little bit more. They have less to scramble up because you're losing variation as you go along, but you're presumably selecting for the best variants. And now you end up with eventually getting to the point where because of the environment, because it's a super cold environment, the organisms are finally getting more and more and more and more and more adapted to that particular environment. But if I go back and I'm going to say that cannot happen, right? I don't know of any way that could happen within a few generations, right? You have to have thousands of individuals born. You're going to have slightly different variants in different individuals, which have a little bit better chance of surviving that environment. Then you have to do it over and over and over again. And look, snow foxes, there's tens of thousands of them in the world, and they're all pretty much the same, right? They don't have a whole lot of variation, right? They have some variation, but not a lot. So you're going to have to sort out that variation to the point where there's not a lot of it left. That's going to take hundreds of thousands of generations to form a species that is consistent, among all those different individuals. All right, so really what I'm talking about here is it is just not nearly enough generations for this to happen. And then you would talk about something like elephants, right? 2 elephants get off the ark, and then there's 100 species of elephants within, just a couple hundred years. Like that means every elephant has to have become a different species of elephant that was ever born. Well, not everyone, but most elephants born were just suddenly different species. But if you have lots of variation, how do they become species that are adapted for a particular location? Because most elephants, when we look in the fossil record, they had characteristics that made it apparent they were adapted to that particular local environment. But if you were just having offspring and you were scrambling up genes, you're going to end up with one offspring has a short trunk and another one has a really super long, upper tusk, and another individual has a long lower tusk. And it's like the combination of one of them has hair and another one doesn't have hair. You're going to scramble 1,000 different characteristics, right? And you're going to end up with this incredible hodgepodge in every individual. You're not going to have consistent species that are adapted to particular environments. Now, in the big scale of things, right? If you have hundreds of thousands of years, what you have is a group of individuals living in an environment. And then that group of individuals, as it reproduces, is making more individuals that have all the variants that they need that work. Like those variants all work in different combinations to make organisms that are similar enough that they're the same species. And they have variation, but they're not crazy variants, they're all kind of adapted to that particular environment. And then as those individuals, or as the environment changes, but if the environment changes slowly over tens of thousands of years, right, they'll slowly change the alleles that they are using more frequently, because they'll be preserved from generation to generation. And if there's new positive mutations, they'll select those. It might take thousands of years to basically increase the number of those positive mutations. But they become better and better and better adapted to the change, that environment. And as it changes, they change along with it. But those mechanisms take thousands of generations. Thousands of generations. Young Earth creationists have to take 2 dogs and turn them into 100 different species of dogs. And each species might have had hundreds of thousands of individuals, but all those individuals were similar to each other. That doesn't make sense within this population genetics model. So coming back to the whole theistic evolution and divine direction, what I said early on, which maybe sounded kind of provocative, I'm saying like young Earth creationists are really theistic evolutionists. Right? They're going to have to say, I think they absolutely must say that those 2 dogs on the ark, God selected them, knew, and I think they're fine with that, right? He knew that they had the variations that were going to be necessary because he could see into the future and see, like, I need Arctic foxes, right? I'm planning for an Arctic fox, right? That wasn't, the whole question of, did he plan for it before the beginning of the world? Because he created the Arctic, he created canines not able to kill anything else, right? And didn't eat meat and didn't die, in the young Earth creationist view of origins. And so did he actually create, Arctic foxes, the plan for Arctic foxes? Well, most young Earth creationists, yes. He foreknew the fall. So he implanted in every single kind of organism that he created all the variation that was needed that could then be combined into and made into future organisms that would be adapted to new, different environments that don't even exist in the original creation. Arctic environments, desert environments, right? Hot pools in Yellowstone, right? All those things are not thought to have existed in the original creation. Those are all corruptions of the perfect creation. So that means God foreknew. So he's got 2 dogs on the ark. He takes those 2 dogs and he knows that the variations exist for making an Arctic fox, right? Here's a whole list, of the variants that are there. And if you take all these variants and you put them together in this package, you get a fennec fox. And if you take all these variants and you put them over here, you're going to have a wolf. And if you take these variants, you have a coyote. Right. So somehow they all exist in there. I would say big problem there. That really can't be true. You can't really squeeze that much variation into 2 individuals. There's just not enough variation there. So you're going to have to employ mutations. But I'm going to argue, and I'm going to suggest to young Earth creationists that mutations aren't so bad. Mutations aren't so bad if you employ God causing mutations on purpose, right? He's guiding mutations to occur to create new variants that could allow for the Arctic fox, right? Hey, I need to make a mutation here that then turns on, it turns on a promoter, which then upregulates the gene that is influencing hair growth, such that you make a lot more and a lot more dense hairs, right? That's a genetic difference between a dog that is short hair versus long hair. You got to have some change in the genetic operating system between those two. And so maybe God is watching those dogs, and as they are migrating north, he's then employing mutations, causing mutations to occur that change those canines, their features, adapt their features. Let's call it that. Adapt their features to living in the climate that they're moving into, right? And then as they move farther north, he's continually shaping that and using natural selection too. But I would say that this would have to be well beyond the rates, all right, in which we observe, the rates of how many mutations happen per generation. Natural selection, based just on natural selection based on like having lots of individuals with different randomly assorted new combinations, right, is going to select. I think young earth creationists need to say that natural selection isn't really the thing doing it. It's really God is not even randomly recombining. He's like, I need that variant, that variant, that variant, that variant, that variant, that variant all together in this particular environment to make this new dog. All right. And if I leave it up to chance, right, I'm going to get, there's like 100,000 different possibilities. And so if I just go into the bag and say, like, I'm going to grab 5 different combinations, I might not get the Arctic fox, right? Chances are I'm not going to get an Arctic fox. So I'm going to direct the crossing over and the pulling apart of the chromosome so that the right chromosome and the right mutation on the right one comes together to create this new package, which is far better, it moves us along in the evolutionary trajectory, right? We're going to move this organism to adapting to that environment like really quickly because we're guiding the whole process. And you see, a theistic evolutionist would say that, or an evolutionary creationist again, there's many different variations and forms of this, but some would say like they would give God the credit for basically creating the process of natural selection. And somehow some would say that he's even guiding and adjusting the odds. So to be sure that we get different variations that allow organisms to be fit for particular environments. But he's doing it over long periods of time. And he's doing it in such a way that like when we analyze it, it doesn't look different than chance. Because that's what it does look like. In most ways, if you go out to a population and you see and you say like, okay, like they just produced 5,000 offspring, and if you were to sequence their entire genomes, it looks like that the parents randomly assorted their genes and gave them to their offspring, right? If God was like increasing the odds of like always getting these things together and as opposed to other variants never coming together, then we would think we would be able to observe that, right? Because you'd be like, hey, why don't these variants ever come together when it's like more likely that these other variants come together? So many theistic evolutionists would say that that if God's in charge, he's kind of like in charge on this level of knowing everything that was going to happen, completely omniscient, and having the whole process play out, but in such a way that it looks like it's hard to see his like direct hand in it. In a similar fashion, it'd be like, when you predict the weather, right? And you say like, hey, look, I can see that it's probably going to be this temperature and there's going to be rain tomorrow and so forth. And you actually see the rain falling out of the sky. And then you were to like, see, how did that happen? Well, there's this little dust up there and then it aggregated on that and the physics all works. And I can explain the whole thing. And I don't have to say like God is actually causing it to rain. Right. But you could also use the words, I think this is what this author is saying, God equipped these critters. And I think what he means is God's guiding this entire process such that he made sure that Arctic foxes are Arctic foxes as part of his plan, that he's in charge of that plan. And what I'm doing here is I'm just saying, well, okay, how would you identify that God is in charge of that? Maybe young earth creationists have an advantage here because they could make a prediction. Natural selection can't do it. As much as they try to employ natural selection to try to like, oh, well, look, natural selection just chose the variants and eventually you ended up with this and that was God's plan. We have enough evidence that natural selection couldn't actually select these packages of alleles for these 100 different species in the space of a few generations, right? If you think that's the case, show me the mathematical model, show me how that would work. Show me how those genomes could make these things within just a few generations. If not, then what a young earth creationist should be predicting is that they should actually be saying this can't actually happen by just natural processes and the statistics of natural selection and how meiosis works and how genomes are reshuffled. Right? All the things that we measure suggest that that can't happen. And therefore, since it did happen, and it does happen, because we'd say like, hey, these Arctic foxes came into existence in just 50 generations, that means God must be going against the odds, right? He must be intervening. He must be constantly tweaking the process. But if he is tweaking the process all the time in order to get outcomes that are extremely unlikely, then shouldn't we be measuring that? Right? I mean, this is why I said that this is me talking off the top of my head, trying to think through this. Shouldn't we be able to measure if the expected probabilities aren't occurring? Right? Seems like there should be a research program by young earth creationists to actually discover and show this is actually occurring. Right? Be able to predict, like, here's what it would be if it was chance, but that's not what we see, and therefore God is involved. Now, here's the rub, right? Things don't appear to be completely chance because of natural selection. Natural selection is not chance. I mean, if you have 1,000 offspring and they all have different combinations of alleles, so they have different characteristics, then some of them are going to be more adapted for the environment than others. They're more likely to survive, in which case they're going to have offspring, in which case they're going to take their genes to the next generation. So I'm fully aware of that. What I'm saying here is that process will not work fast enough to make an Arctic fox within a few generations. Look at my dire wolf video, which just came out, right? The dire wolf was in existence before the Ice Age, which was only a couple hundred years after the flood in the young earth model. And there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dire wolves that were all very similar to one another. That's a particular genetic package, right? Dire wolves. And there's hundreds of thousands of them. That would take thousands of years just to make that many, well, let's say hundreds of years just to make that many dire wolves by themselves. But how did the dire wolf specific combination of alleles come into existence from another set of genes, alleles, in the original Arc animals, right? The original Arc canines. They had to have all the variation for making dire wolves and gray wolves and coyotes and African wild dogs and dingoes. And I mean, let's go down a list of 100, and gray foxes and red foxes, and all the domesticated dogs, right? And so all of them had to go through this process of making variations and then having natural selection select on which variation package works best in that environment. What I'm saying is that process can't happen in a single generation. Can't happen in 10 generations. Can't happen in 100 generations. It's going to take thousands of generations to do that. And incredibly wasteful too, since for young creationists, combining all those radically different alleles is going to create a lot of radically, like, totally misfit and maladapted individuals, which are going to have terrible survival value. And so that's a really, really inefficient process for making two animals into hundreds of species. You can take one species has thousands of individuals, right? And when they have offspring, they're going to remix their alleles, right? But because their alleles aren't radically different from one another, right? Radically different in the sense that I have contained in this species 100 different species. That's what young creationists are saying. Within these two individuals, there's 100 species inside of them. And so when they reproduce, they're like, man, I'm going to make all these crazy variations. A species has less variation, right? They have variations that are like little tweaks on themes. slightly different hair colors, slightly different behaviors, slightly, all things that are sort of like within the bounds of a particular species variation. And when they reproduce, yes, they produce new combinations, but they're not going to be radically different combinations. That's why you maintain the species. Dire wolves make more dire wolves, make more dire wolves that make more dire wolves. And that's why we see, every species you look at, they're making more of themselves, something that's similar to themselves. Except they have a small little difference here. Like these alleles make a slightly faster version of a wolf. And maybe if the environment needs a faster version of a wolf, that one survives better. And so those allele combinations become more common. That's why the evolutionary process is slow. That's why it takes thousands of generations. But it's consistent and it can efficiently adapt to environments without the gigantic amount of death waste that's going to occur in the young Earth creationist model. Kind of ironic, actually. In the young creationist model, I think there would be massive amounts of unfit animals that were completely incapable of surviving in their environments if they just employ this random model of genetic variation, right? That's why I'd say they're going to have to argue that God is specifically like, I'm going to bring these variants together and I'm not going to allow these other variants to come together. But that would break all the rules of basic Mendelian genetics. And if all the rules of Mendelian genetics are broken all the time because God is interfering and not, let me give you a simple example. Mendelian genetics, independent assortment, would tell you that males have an X and a Y chromosome. And then when they make sperm, right, if I'm making 1,000 sperm, 500 of them have, an X and 500 have a Y, right? And so then there's a 50-50 chance that the X or the Y is going to come together and fertilize the egg, right? And that's why we would say like there's a 50% chance of having a female or a male offspring, a boy or a girl. Right now, if God was saying like, all right, I don't like those odds, right? And I want to have like 90%, female offspring. Well, then, when the two chromosomes split into the two different cells where you make 50% of 51, he'd have to either kill off all the X, all the Y sperm, only leaving the X, sperm. And then that would create an increased opportunity for X's to combine with X's to make females. But that would go against what is the basic rules of Mendelian genetics. So imagine that's what you have to do to make an Arctic fox in a few generations. You have to go in and just like, okay, we're just going to all those things that are like happen by like basic statistics, 50-50 chance. Everything you learned in your basic basic biology class when you're doing genetics, it's like, hey, I have a monohybrid, tall plant and a monohybrid, a homozygous tall plant, a homozygous short plant, big T, little t, little t. What's going to happen when you put the two together? You're going to get big T, little t, right? And you're going to expect that to happen every single time. Right? If you saw something completely different, you'd have to come up with a whole different new way of understanding genetics. Because you've just broken that basic, what appears to be a basic rule that we've observed over many, many, many years. And so this is where I'm saying, if you're going to argue that two dogs got off an ark and then 100 years later, you have a fennec fox and you have an Arctic fox, in which you have tens of thousands of different variations of their genes, all combined in a package over here. And it has tens of thousands of copies over here that all together make that fennec fox really well adapted to its environment and the Arctic fox really well adapted to its environment. What are the intermediates between those two? It seems like all the intermediates have to be unadapted. They would have to have originally had combinations of Arctic fox and fennec fox in one animal. Now, here's the bigger challenge. We have lots of fossils of canines, and we have lots of extinct species of canines. Young Earth creationists should be looking for all these bastards, all right? They should be looking for all these boy, those variants, like that individual had a horrible combination, right? It's a total mixture of like 5 different species, right? They should see intermediates of all these different species, like all over the place. In fact, those intermediates are more likely to have died, right, quite quickly, and or succumb to situations in the environment. So maybe it would have even been preserved even more than other ones did. All right, so it all comes back to, what do you think God is doing? How is he involved in creation? How is he involved in the day-to-day operations in order to achieve his purposes? Right? If he's guiding things to every end that he has already foreordained, what is the process he's using to do that? How is he directing that? And can you observe that? This is what I'm getting to, really, is we're coming right down to the difference between what intelligent design, the ID folks, who are trying to argue that you can in some way see this, you can actually use science to try to show that God must be involved. And young earth creationists often will say, well, this is so well designed, only God could have done that. But what I haven't heard is like, well, what exactly is God's method of doing that? And if you want to say is all miracles, well, then you have to posit that God is changing different natural laws, like his general providence, his general rules for how things work that he created the world by. But those don't work in order to make an Arctic fox within that short a period of time. So he has to step in and make those changes. But if that's the case, shouldn't you be able to actually like test for that? Should you be able to see it? This is where some of the divisions between intelligent design come in. Progressive creationists who say that God is, sort of intervenes at different times in history. So a progressive creationist, like there's hundreds of millions of years, and there are organisms that they're adapted, and God has created them, and he's created them with the ability to adapt and shift, but not make the big jump to from fish to amphibians. And so God has to come in, and there they see him interjecting. In other words, I'm going to add some genes. Hey, this organism doesn't have the sufficient genes it needs, programs that it needs. So I'm going to add some programs here. And then I'm taking an organism that's there alive, that has done its own adaptation, following the basic rules, like the rules that we would, as we study the world, we'd say like, oh yeah, I can see how natural selection is happening. There's mutations and they seem random, and they're making things. And they would say like, but those natural mechanisms aren't sufficient for making the leap to a different kind of organism. And so God has to interject into that, interrupt that process, add to the process. So what are young earth creationists doing? What are they? I think they're actually basic theistic evolutionists. I think they think that God is actively involved in pushing natural selection in particular directions to make sure that all the different species are the ones that he wants, rather than I just set up a process and it's like deistic, like, oh, lots of random variations, random crosses are happening. So hundreds of millions of different variants are being thrown out there. And then some of them survive and some don't. But I didn't know which ones were going to survive and which didn't. But all of them are part of my process that I made, right? That would be a very sort of theistic evolution sort of perspective, right? God's in charge of the whole thing in the sense that he set it all up, but doesn't really have prescribed outcomes that he is specifically guiding things toward. Now I'm getting into some pretty deep waters here, and unanswerable questions. But I hope I've given you some sense of what's been going on in my mind in terms of, I often come down to this. I come down to like, where is the moment in which what is the actual pathway, I guess. Maybe I'm thinking like a biologist, which is thinking about, I think a lot about genetic mechanisms and control elements and so forth, right? And small changes to, upregulating and downregulating something can have drastic, big effects on organisms. So like tiny tweaks can have big effects. Is God a tiny tweaker that then causes these big outcomes? But you still can't like see the actual tweezers that God is using. Like, I'm influencing this mutation at base pair number 5 and not base pair number 6, because base pair number 5 is where like that protein actually attaches to the DNA and is a DNA binding protein. And that's going to make a big difference in how that gene is regulated. Do young earth creationists think that that is what God is doing? Is he tinkering all along the way, every single step? Is he stepping back and saying like, Arctic foxes are a possibility from all the genetic variation I've given the original canines and the canines that are on the ark. Here's the variation they have. So here's the possibilities that could happen. Could make Arctic foxes, but maybe there won't be Arctic foxes. Maybe there'll be, foxes that are adapted to the far north, but they're not like quite adapted to like living in polar regions. But that's a possibility. It's just that it may never actually happen because the right combination might not be hit upon using normal providence, like just the reassortment of genes. Maybe that reassortment will never come up. Or if it comes up, it only comes up in one animal, but you got to have multiple animals that have the same basic assortment in order for them to reproduce and make more copies of that, for them to actually survive in that environment as a population, as a species. And so maybe the species we have are just the ones we get out of the 100,000 or 1,000,000 different possibilities that there were. And these just happen to be the ones that we get. And that's like kind of like saying, if you went back and you restarted the world, or you like did it over again, would you get Arctic foxes again? And so maybe not. Maybe you get something else. Right? That's Stephen Jay Gould's sort of like replaying the tape thing. If you replayed the tape, would you get the same organisms? Would you get the exact same things? Well, on the really specific level, no, because if it's all random mutations, you're probably never going to hit on that exact set of mutations that gives you exactly Arctic fox. You might have maybe there's going to be an Arctic cat, all right, that has these types of features. Or maybe you do get a canine, but it doesn't have exactly these features, right? Maybe it doesn't have a tail, all right, and it has a really short snout. And it's a basically a same kind of species living in, has same types of adaptations, but not the exact shape and form. Or is God and directing the creation of Arctic fox, and that was the only plan? You can see I'm in some pretty deep theological waters right now, and I'm not going to have the answer for you. This is more of a challenge for younger creationists to think about. Are they intelligent designists? Are they theistic evolutionists that have like a really strong, like a theistic evolution that says like God is completely sovereign and is controlling every atom and every single thing that happens. And even though we can't see that, all of it is guided. Every single little step of it is guided. Or is it most of it's guided? I have endpoints and I'll get there using whatever happens. I will push and shove and kind of like manipulate it toward a particular direction, but I'm not in control of every single little step. These are lots of different theological positions within very conservative Christian denominations and in different arguments about God's sovereignty. All right, I've been talking far too long about this, but as I said before, this is kind of a different episode. This is just me talking off the top of my head, and kind of like part of it is when I do this, you can think about the stuff in your head a lot, and because a lot of stuff makes sense in your head, or maybe it doesn't make sense in your head. And then when you start to talk about it, you kind of learn a lot about the way you're thinking about your own thoughts. And new things come to your mind that you might not have done if you had just kept it in your head. And so I apologize if you've waited for an hour for an answer and some kind of like divine truth to come to you. But, and really you just find out it's just like me, like using this as a way to get myself to think about this. But maybe you've traveled along this path maybe you've had some of these thoughts. Maybe you've never thought of this as a question, and maybe it'll stimulate you to think about it. And leave me some comments. I'm really interested in what you think about this. And I know I have a diverse audience, right? I know there's young earth creationists. I know there's theistic evolutionists. I know there's probably intelligent designists, right? There's progressive creationists. There's agnostics, and there's outright atheists who would say, well, God is in control of any of this at all. And so like all of this doesn't matter anyway. But nonetheless, I think even those individuals who might say, well, I mean, there is no creator, there is no higher being, you should still have questions about Arctic foxes and like the whole idea of like replaying the tape. How close would you get to the same type of thing? And it really is kind of a question about ourselves too. Who we are, what we are, why we are, and how we're changing as well. All right. Hey, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening to my machinations on the topic of divine sovereignty and speciation. Call it that. That's it. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.